Before we get too far, I want to keep tonight fairly short, just because it's been a long week for all of us. It's been a long week. We've had a lot of activities, had a lot of things going on, and we covered compassion last week. We looked at compassion, the midot compassion last week in a little bit more detail. This week, we're just going to kind of discuss it openly and what we've learned this past week and go from there. And for those, like I said, who are wanting to take the class for credit, we have a couple of sheets left.
Okay.
And I can print out more if need be.
Bring this weekend, I guess.
So I want to take just, maybe 5 minutes or so to quickly go over what we talked about last week. And compassion, so maybe it'll kind of jog our memories what we talked about. And if you went through this week studying compassion, writing in your journal, that type of a thing, maybe it'll help jog your memory and bring up some thoughts that you've had for this week. I've had quite a few instances to think about compassion and what areas of my life was lacking, what areas of my life that I felt really comfortable in, that God has shown me some things that helped me grow spiritually. Last week we looked at compassion. To understand what compassion is one of the midot of Mussar. It's certainly one of the attributes of God that He bestows upon us, that He says that just as this is my attribute, this is part of what makes me holy, you too shall be holy. You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. And an integral part of that holiness is His compassion. So it's important to understand from a Hebrew perspective, from the perspective of the Hebrew language and the Jewish culture, what does compassion mean? Not from the westernized translation of compassion, but what Hebrew words are traditionally translated as compassion. Do you remember what compassion is in Hebrew? Anybody remember? Rachamim or rachum, right? Rachamim or rachum is the Hebrew word that is translated as compassion. We talked about what that meant. We've looked at the book. If you've read the book, if you've read the section on compassion, in the book, you'll probably find that I may disagree with the author a little bit on this. I think he makes some valid points, but I think he also is slightly off the mark a little bit on the issue of compassion as well. He quotes in the book a passage from Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, who speaks of compassion really being an emotion, that it is a part of who we are. It's a reflection of the heart. It is an emotion. And then the author, Alan Morinus, kind of counter-argues that a little bit and talks about it on a slightly deeper level than just emotion. But I think he misses the point when he refers to, when he kind of takes the emotional side out of compassion, because I believe they're two sides of the same coin. Okay, he uses a reference, the Hebrew term Rachum. For some reason I had Mussar in my mind. The Hebrew term Rachum, which is translated as compassion. The author of Everyday Holiness, you referenced it as, or associate it more with closeness, with close identity, or feeling close to someone. And he removes it from compassion. I don't know if you can do that. I mean, he removes that from emotion. And I don't know if you can do that. Emotion and closeness oftentimes go together. They're two sides of the same coin, like I said. So it's really difficult to have one without the other. But I did explain the difference between compassion and chesed, or compassion and loving kindness, in the Hebrew language. When we think of it in the English language, compassion and loving kindness, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of difference, right? I mean, it seems to be pretty straightforward. They're kind of the same thing. But from a Hebrew perspective, okay, chesed, which is traditionally translated as loving kindness or love, okay, is more an association with a covenant type of love. It may or may not be associated with emotion. but it's a covenant type of love. It is oftentimes associated with marriage. That when you enter into a marriage covenant, a marriage contract, you are saying that I am dedicated to this person, I'm dedicated to this covenant, I have a covenant obligation. Okay, when we look at the descriptions of Chesed in Scripture, we find things like leaving the four corners of your field for the poor, the widow, and the orphan. Okay, we look at things like justice. Do not allow unequal measures or unequal weights. That type of a thing. Okay, we can also look at how we treat the stranger and the foreigner. Commandments in regards to treating the stranger and the foreigner. Commandments in regards to how we treat women within the Jewish community. Commandments in regards to how we treat animals. Those things are all associated with chesed, loving kindness. These are actions that we do that show our obedience to the Scriptures, our obedience to God, and our faithfulness to God. That is the Hebrew term chesed, loving kindness. Rachum, compassion, and let me back up here just a little bit. Chesed we will cover later. Okay, chesed is one of the midot of Mussar, and it's treated differently from compassion. It's treated differently for a reason. So, rachum, compassion, almost always denotes emotion, a strong emotion, empathy, a deep connection. We looked at the example last week of Yeshua, as in was it Luke 7? I think it was in Luke 7, when Yeshua and his disciples met up with a band of or a funeral procession. And then it said that he had compassion upon the woman, for she was a widow who had just also lost her son. She had lost everything to her. And he looked upon her with compassion. Okay, there was not a covenant obligation there as much as there was compassion. In other words, his heart leapt in him and reached out to this woman to raise her from the dead. There was no covenant obligation for him to raise her son from the dead. There was no covenant obligation for him to raise her son from the dead. He did so because he felt compassion upon her. His heart jumped within him and he wanted to alleviate her pain. In fact, the author, Alan Marinas, kind of associates that as well. An intense desire to want to alleviate the suffering of someone close to you. What are some examples of compassion? When we think of compassion in a Hebrew sense, what are some examples of that? Let me give you an example, and I'll give you guys a chance to respond. But, I was talking with Lori on the way over here about this. We were kind of discussing a little bit, and I said, I think compassion oftentimes is associated with experience. What we experience will oftentimes penetrate our hearts. I have compassion for people who suffer mental illness. I have compassion for people who suffer from anxiety and depression and things like that, because I have suffered from anxiety. I have suffered severe anxiety that's brought on depression. I have suffered from OCD. I know what that feels like. I know what the feeling of depression feels like. I know what the feeling of intense anxiety and anxiety attacks and things like that. I know what it feels like. So when I see someone who is going through that, or I hear of somebody who is going through that, it sparks a compassion in me because I am able to associate with them. There's a closeness there that says, I know what you're going through because I've walked in your shoes. And it sparks a deep desire to want to relieve or alleviate their suffering, their pain, because I've experienced it. So it sparks a compassion in me. Somebody who's going through drug addiction or alcoholism, I have chesed for them. I have loving kindness for them in that I have an obligation to minister to them and to show them compassion and love, or to show them love and to show them patience and to help them overcome their addiction. But rachum, or compassion, that's a little bit harder for me. The reason being is not that that I think there's anything wrong, or not that I disparage them in any way, shape, or form, only that I don't have that same connection with a drug addict or an alcoholic that I do with somebody who suffered through anxiety. Because I've never been addicted to drugs. I've never taken any illegal drugs. I've never been addicted to alcohol. So I don't know what that feels like. But I do know what anxiety attacks feel like. So I'm able to connect with them maybe a little bit more. Okay. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Please go ahead. Right on.
Okay, so when I read that section, it said it was talking about the two words Rachem and Rachem.
Right.
Is that spelled Rechem? Is that how you pronounce that? Rachem? Or is
It's Rachum.
Okay,
It's
in
the
the
transliteration.
In the book it said Em. So
It's because I believe that Rachem it shares the same root word. Rachem is womb. Okay, Rachem is womb. It shares the same root word as womb. Rachum is compassion.
Okay.
If you wanted to say the womb of a woman, you would say Rachem. Does that make sense? Okay, but they share a similar root word. Why would they? And we talked about this last week. But why would Rachem, compassion, and Rachum, compassion, and Rachem, womb? Why would they share the same root word in Hebrew? What are some of the similarities? What is God trying to tell us there?
Did
you say last night that Rachem was the place?
No, that's Hamakom. Hamakom is the place, yeah. That's a good memory, though. Good memory. Yes, Hamakom is the place.
Well, it was basically talking about the closeness of a mother with her unborn child.
Right. Yes, it's an association between a mother and her unborn child. Absolutely. I use the example, although I don't have my notes with me, but I use the example of a couple of Psalm references where God speaks to having compassion upon us like a father has compassion upon his children. Having compassion on us like a mother has compassion upon her unborn child. Okay? And when God speaks in those terms of compassion, I mean, it's kind of hard to imagine. Now, I want you to think about this for a moment, because compassion is, I agree with Samson, Rabbi Hirsch, and that emotion is a big part of compassion. It plays a big part in it. And we think of God, and God speaks to us, and he speaks to us clearly, oftentimes, about his compassion for us, that Rachum or Rachamim for his people. And he also speaks of Chesed, that loving kindness. But Rachum goes much deeper than that. Like I said, it is associated with emotion, a deep feeling of connection, a deep feeling of closeness, a deep feeling to want to alleviate, like a mother would want to alleviate the suffering of her child, or the closeness a mother feels for the infant who is inside of her womb, type of a thing. And God uses that same language for us, and he says that I am close to you. Will have compassion on you as a mother has compassion on the child that is in her womb. What does that say about God? I mean, if God were stoic, and he was just, the emotion and things like that were beyond him, then we would just simply see the term chesed. And yet, over and over and over again, God is described as being a jealous God. He's described as being an angry God. He is described as being a God who is wounded, who is hurt. Before the flood, God regretted making mankind. And that speaks of a deep wound within God that says, look what you have done. A deep wound, a deep hurt. Yes, he grieved. Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. You're absolutely right. And that was the one thing I had a hard time understanding for a long time. Being able to see that aspect of God, being able to, to look deeper than a God who is somewhat influenced by deistic theology, to some degree, where you look upon a God who's high and lofty, and that's true, who's sitting on his throne, and that is true, but he's just kind of looking down on man, judging the world, judging mankind, and waiting for us to get out of line so he can bring the belt out, And it took me, and I've said this before, so you'll have to hear it again. I had a hard time. I really had a hard time connecting that, connecting a God of emotion, a God of passion, a God of sorrow, a God of great compassion, with the God that we're oftentimes taught, who's just kind of sitting on his throne. He's waiting for us to get out of the line, until I was able to pick Sarah up for the first time. When I was able to hold my little daughter. Yeah, I know she's embarrassed. But when I was able to hold her and I was able to pick her up and look at her, it was different. I knew right then and there that, no, this is who God is.
We can look at his son, who showed a lot of emotions while he was here on earth.
Yes.
Where do you think he got it from? From his father.
Absolutely. Our emotions, we oftentimes want to be stoic. We don't want to show emotion. We want to, we think that showing emotion is weakness, and certainly for men, boy, a real man doesn't cry. A real man doesn't have tears, that type of thing. You show weakness when you do that, right? And yet God clearly is described as a God of emotion and great passion. And that is part of who we are. And when we stifle that and we try to hide those emotions and bury those things or what have you, we're burying a big part of the spiritual nature that he has given us. It's part of the spark of a spark of the divine that is within us. Boy, that sounds kind of New Ageist, doesn't it? A spark of the divine. What I mean by that is it's part of being made in the image of God. Part of what it means to be made in the image of God is that we have the ability to feel.
Well,
If we
even
didn't,
when
what's the...
Yeshua was on the cross and he said, "Why have you forsaken me?" That hurt deep.
Of course it did. Of course it did. And just before then, at the Garden of Gethsemane, Lord, Father, if it be your will, to take this cup from my hand. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. When when Lazarus died and he wept. He wept. And I used the example earlier of the woman, the widowed woman who had just lost her son. I truly believe, even though the scripture is somewhat silent on this, it said that he had compassion upon her. I truly believe that when he saw her and he saw the hurt that was in her, that he wept. That his heart broke just as her heart broke. That's the kind of connection that he has with us. That he truly does feel what we feel. He identifies with what we go through. He knows the struggles that we go through. That's why he walked amongst us.
Right there.
What's that?
That was a beautiful definition right there. Her heart was broken, and when he saw her, his heart broke.
Absolutely.
That's
right.
Perfect. That's it.
That is compassion.
I think compassion is something that we have to learn. I don't believe we're born with it. Because when we're born, we're kind of selfish little babies, little babies. And then, but as we go through life, as we go through different experiences, and somebody else will be telling what happened to them, and it's something that had happened to you sometime back,
Right.
you can feel it like a stab wound to your own heart. I mean, you actually, they're talking and you're weeping, and you feel it like it just happened to you, because you can connect. You know that pain. You've been there. You've walked in those shoes, And I think compassion's such a hard thing to put in terms, but what you said was just absolutely perfect. You literally feel in yourself what that person's feeling in themselves, and you connect. It's if you yourself
Absolutely,
are just
yeah.
wounded right along with them. And it could be a total stranger, or it can be someone you know. But
Absolutely.
connect, because what's going on with them is something you've had happen to you.
Right.
So compassion is something we learn through walking out life on earth and going through the fiery furnaces and all the hurts that life brings.
It is, in a very intimate way, it is empathy. It can be tough sometimes because I look at a child who is being bullied, or a child who's being picked on, or a child who's going through a difficult time. My mind immediately goes to, what if that were Sarah? Or what if that were Leah? And what would I feel? How would they feel? I know what it would do to me. So immediately, I have compassion. Immediately, my heart reaches out to them because I make that connection, and it's almost an overwhelming feeling.
Yeah, it's like you yourself are pierced by it. I mean, it's like a physical, we could say it's a feeling, but when we feel it, it's not just a feeling. It goes deeper. It's like a physical wound to your own heart. Whether it's
Absolutely.
a child or a stranger or somebody or in your community, it's just it's more than a feeling. It's you physically experience it in your own heart. You feel pierced or wounded, bleeding, and you cry out.
Absolutely.
And your first reaction is to hold them, to comfort them, to do anything you think you might be able to do to stop that pain, to stop, to wipe their tears, whatever.
Yeah.
Stick your neck out into situations just because we've
Absolutely.
been there, or we've done that, we've felt that, and we actually experience it. We forget that we were created in adult relationship with our Creator and with each other. And so I think that this is one of those mysterious things that God placed in us. It's a learning thing. The more we walk through life, the more we find we have compassion for others when they weep, when they cry out. I mean, you can walk by a perfect stranger that's sobbing their heart out on the street corner and just feel that sudden, I have to do something.
Yeah.
I don't know this person. But that pain is so, it's like we're here, so we physically feel that pain. It's more than just a little feeling, we feel it.
And I like what you had said in regards to something that connects us all, because right after the creation of Adam, it is not good for man to be alone. We were created to need one another. We were created to connect with one another, to depend upon one another for relationship. That's why I've said over and over and over again, when Yeshua talks about building up treasures in heaven, we're not going to care, about the latest sound system or a new car or how big the house is. We're not going to care about, the streets made of gold. I believe the description of the streets made of gold is simply an analogy that, gold is going to be so worthless that we'll pave our streets with it. That it's not going to mean anything. The treasures that we will build that will go into eternity are the relationships that we build, first and foremost with Him and with one another, because that is what is lasting, not the physical things of this world. The treasures are the relationships that we have with one another, we build with one another. That is a big part, I believe, of what carries over.
Exactly. In Mussar, we live in the Talmud, we're talking about the commandments, but he finishes with, but the greatest of these is love. And Rabbi Sha'arey tells us that with all you can have all this other stuff and all these gifts and speak like it in tongues of angels and this and that, but if you haven't got love, love's the only thing we get to keep. Love's the only thing we get to take out of here with us. So love is the absolute greatest treasure of all. And I don't know if any of us have yet begun to comprehend just how connected He wants His people to be. And I'm only starting to get a glimmer. The more I read, the more I study. And I've told you, Pastor Sutton wants to come see you as a Black Baptist church. Being in his church from time to time, he tells his people that, we come in different colors and varieties. He goes, we better learn to love each other right here, right now, because heaven will not be segregated.
That's right. All right.
They haven't
Absolutely,
just,
yeah.
They might miss some of the other things that we think are important, but these people have love going on, and this pastor is constantly reminding them that you need to learn to love each other right here, right now. It's nothing to do with pigmentation, but it's that God connection because He wants His people to be connected. And I think compassion is one of those mysterious things that is planted in us from the very beginning. It's on the seed information that we come from, because that really connects us in a deep way, like in a tenderness that it's hard to even put it to words, but that tenderness for one another.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
It's an amazing thing. I think it's, you talk about the mystery of creation. I think that's one of those mysteries that I think is planted in us. It's on the information on the original seeds of life that to be able to have this kind of feeling or reaction to other people's pain, and it draws you close. And it's really trying to put it to words is hard because this type of passion and love is beyond words. I mean, it goes so deep. You know, when you can feel pain and start crying for a total stranger, it's a deep thing. It's a connecting thing because we were made for relationship. Sometimes we don't get that.
Yep. You know, I remember when Lori and I lost our unborn child. And after spending all night, you know, all night at the hospital and just an event that just shook us both up. It was very hard to handle. And Lori's brother, Garrett, and the rest of the family came over. You know, they came over to our house. And Garrett, I was just kind of sitting at the table and I was listening. I was sitting at the kitchen table and I was listening to a Casting Crowns song. Gosh, now I can't remember the name of it. It was a popular Casting Crowns song. Anyways, it was very penetrating at that point. It was very, very hard. And I was just sitting there at the kitchen table and just weeping. And Garrett came and like sit right across from me, and he just reached across the table and he just started weeping with me. He just broke down, and we both just sat there, just heartbroken. You know, and I knew at that moment that Garrett had compassion, that he was feeling what I felt and what Lori felt, that there was something that was deep there and that he felt that. And, you know, there was something that I'll always take with me, you know, that will always provide a closeness because I know that we had that connection that went beyond just, okay, I need to go over there and go visit them because that's my obligation. But it was much, much deeper than that. And there was a true spiritual heart connection that was there.
Yeah, and when you pointed out, it doesn't just go away. Once you've made that spiritual connection, that compassion thing, it doesn't go away. You don't lose it. You feel connected to that person.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
It's amazing, and I think it's just one of those things that God sits back and smiles and
Just like a
hopes that
mother
we-
has on her
we
child.
get it, because this is how He connects us through that compassion and that compassion He has for us.
Yep.
It's an amazing thing. But I think
Absolutely.
stumbling to look for words, and I think the book's pretty good on that, but it's a very hard thing to pinpoint it because it is so deep and connecting. And you don't lose it. It doesn't go away. You always feel that because it's deeper than flesh. It's like your spirit's touched.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't lose that. It's amazing.
Absolutely.
What were you saying?
It might have started out with Lori's brother, whom I love, as Hesed,
Mm-hmm.
and then because of the situation, turned over to
Yep,
I always
I
forget that
agree.
you're related to Garrett. I love him to pieces. He's such a neat guy.
Yeah,
Also,
funny.
we need to remember also that if we have been in certain experiences and then a similar experience comes up, Scripture doesn't say anything about it, but we know that Yosef had passed. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So he knew about death, about how it felt inside, because he and Yosef had to have some relationship.
Sure. Right. Absolutely.
Okay? I mean, he was his worldly father. Okay? He knew the difference, but I mean, there was a relationship there. And so that might have taken him back to when Yosef passed.
Could have. Absolutely. That's a good point. I know I do that. You know, I mean, we just ended the Shiva period. And it's amazing how oftentimes during the Shiva period my father comes to mind. Because when I think of, when I think of somebody who's lost a loved one, especially a parent, when they've lost a parent, and my heart immediately reaches out, and it just brings back a flood of memories and connections to my father. That's why, oftentimes I bring up my father during the Shiva period, because that's the connection I'm able to make. I'm able to go, I can understand, at least on some level, what you feel, because I've been there. I know what that feels like, and it is tough.
You know,
In the last 2 years, the synagogue has lost a lot of parents.
We have, and there's a lot of compassion around here for it.
Yeah, that was my point, right?
Absolutely. Janet, what are your thoughts on compassion? I know you're a thinker. I know you process these things. So what do you think? Do you disagree on compassion? Do you agree with the author of the book? What are your thoughts? I know my thoughts are, leave my candy alone.
Share. Compassion
Is-
is sharing.
Not when it comes to a Reese chocolate peanut butter.
there's no compassion there.
Hey, Lori, catch.
Whoops.
I could have done better.
That's why we don't throw things across the table.
Yeah. They have a drink, Maggie.
Sarah, you got.
Can you give me a napkin?
Hurry. Sarah. Dennis is going to do
Well,
it.
Jonathan, you'll have a lot of editing to do.
Oh, he'll leave it in there just for the fun of it.
You probably
better
would,
not.
yeah.
For those who don't see, Jimmy got a bath.
Yes.
Compassion. I guess I've always considered it something that you do out of instinct more than thought.
Okay.
Thank you.
Dennis.
I could see that. That makes sense. Yep. Because I think there's a connection to emotion there. Mm-hmm. That, when your emotion is involved, your instinct, you don't have to think about, if your child needs something, you don't have to think about it. It's just,
No, you just
snap right to it.
instinctively do what you need to.
right, yeah.
And I look at compassion in the same way. And true compassion, acting in compassion versus loving kindness.
Mm-hmm.
As the comparisons I was looking at. And compassion is an instinctive action.
That's a good analogy. I like it. That works. Jonathan, what about you?
Agree with that. I guess I have a question. Is how do you, if it's so much a instinct, which I believe it is, how do you work at growing it in a way?
I can't hear you back here pulling that.
We'll come closer. Like, think of a time where you could have shown compassion and you didn't. What was the reason why?
Fear.
Yes.
Number one reason, fear.
That's right.
In
Fear
fact,
of being vulnerable.
that was my assignment at the end of last week. I'm glad you mentioned that, because I had brought up that same point. That was compassion is a soul trait, and the whole purpose of Mussar is to elevate those soul traits within us to be holy, so that we can be servants of God and His kingdom. If compassion is something that is connected to us on another level, that is more associated with instinct or emotion, how do we elevate that? And my exercise that I asked the class to think about, which is a good interlude to that, is examine some of those areas of compassion, those areas in which you had compassion that obviously stuck out at you, and even those areas where you think, you know what, I acted in hesed, I acted in loving kindness, but there was a little bit of compassion that was missing. Maybe I didn't act out of compassion, it was more out of hesed. So Lord, what in my life do I need to work on, or what does your Spirit need to work on in me, that I can make a deeper connection with others, so that, when I do see somebody in need, I am giving not just out of obligation, but there is a soul connection where I'm able to see people like you do.
How many times maybe are we, if compassion is instinctive, how many times have we started to feel the emotion and chose to shut it off? But
That's true.
even if we did do what we needed to, it still shut the emotion off.
And in today's world, I mean, growing up, when I was in my 20s and 30s and stuff like that, if you saw somebody pulled off on the side of the road, okay, it was different then to pull over and offer assistance, okay? In today's world, that may be a dangerous thing.
Not if you're wearing that hat.
That's true. That's true. That reminds you, I was talking about taking a couple of the bumper stickers off of our car yesterday. I thought, well, I can remove a couple of the bumper stickers because they're getting old. They're getting kind of, they're getting kind of bad shape, so I could just kind of scrape them off. And Lori said, the NRA sticker, leave it on there. Leave it on there because, if they see that parked in front of the house, they may go, maybe we should think twice. It's like having, even if you have a little miniature Chihuahua thing as a dog, you can still put up a warning dog warning sign on your yard. Of course, once they see that little thing,
That might be crossing that line of lie.
My front door at eye level, when you walk up to my door, there's an NRA sticker, and a United States Marine Corps sticker, and a God You Trust right there. That's it. You're looking straight at it.
well, there you go.
If you want to look at the side, it says got a gun, got a shot.
That's the one I like.
I mean, yeah.
Yeah. In that case, when my mother down in Pueblo, there would be drunks that would come up and ask her if she had any money. And she said, no, I don't have any money. But she said, if you'll go out and pull some weeds or take my trash out, she says, I'll give you a cup of coffee and a sandwich. And word got around that she wasn't going to give you any money, but boy, she could make a good sandwich and a good cup of coffee, and she got a lot of things done. Is that compassion, or is it gauging this situation?
It doesn't have to be one or the other. I mean, good compassion also uses wisdom. We can see compassion. We can see somebody on the street corner and have compassion on them and want to help them, but we also don't want to enable somebody if we know that person is prone to using those funds for nefarious reasons. Then, compassion, and the author of the book alludes to this too. Marinus alludes to this as well. In fact, it's one of the questions on the sheet. Is it possible to have compassion and punishment at the same time? Can you have compassion and punishment at the same time?
Of course you can, yeah.
Well, and that's the point of the book. So you got the answer. I gave you a freebie. There you go.
Okay, I'll give you an example. One time, I was being a twerp, I guess. I was disobedient. And my dad hardly ever, my mother was the disciplinarian, and she, yeah, let's leave it there. But my dad spanked me. But the issue was, he had tears in his eyes when he was doing it. So that was definitely.
Absolutely. Every time one of the girls gets out of line and they have to be punished, believe me, there's a lot of compassion there because I really don't want to do it. You do it because you have to, but you do it because you are having compassion. You are trying to teach them. And your heart immediately jumps out when you have to punish your children. It's hard not to get your heart involved unless you're a narcissist and could care less about anyone but yourself. Anyone with any semblance of humanity, it's hard to punish your children and not have compassion associated with it. You know what I mean? So yeah, absolutely. I think compassion and punishment can go hand in hand because sometimes that is a compassionate act, is to teach and deter from behavior that's going to lead to wrongdoing. God shows it to us all the time.
Well, Scripture says that he chastises those whom he loves. So if he's not punishing you, then he probably doesn't love you anymore, right?
Yeah, right.
Well, and
but he does show us right there, even in Torah, that if he loves you, he's going to chastise you to get you. I mean, if you're going this way or this way, he needs to get you back this way.
Right.
That is compassion, in the sense that, sometimes we have to give our children a swat on the butt because they won't listen, they want to run out in the street, or, if they do that, they can be killed.
Well, and both of our girls are getting to the age, one already is, and the other one is getting to that age where, they probably moved past that, the corporal punishment with a swat on the tuchus stage. Never. Never.
The iPad. The iPhone.
Jonathan's going to have Hannah over his lap when she's 19. What, bam?
It was the worst thing you could do to my son is to take away his phone for a day. He would think that he had died, that you had just killed him.
Mine was the
I could
40
walk him all day long now, but
I'd
take away
rather
the
have had
phone.
a spanking.
And each child is different, obviously, on how you do that. Each child is different what punishment works with. Some kids, a swat on the tuchus just doesn't work. It just does not work. You got to find other ways of doing it.
Come down on you for that.
What?
Now, Johnny and Chris, when they get into it, and they do get into it, regardless of their different ages, I make them sit and stare at each other.
You need a get along shirt.
I do. I
Yes.
make them stare
I
at
made
each
one
other
for the girls.
until they apologize and they start laughing. But
That was a
Get
genius
along
idea.
shirt. It's a very large shirt, and they both wear the same shirt together. And if they want to do something, they got to go together and work together
Oh, boy.
because they're wearing the same shirt.
They have to wear it until they get along.
They use
well,
the
that'd be
same
hard
head
for
pole.
Johnny.
One uses one arm hole, one uses the other.
Johnny would have to carry Chris around everywhere he goes.
I heard once.
Although Leah's grown up enough that Leah would have to do the same thing with Sarah. Have to carry it around. But I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I heard once about a parent who they couldn't get through their kid. They couldn't get through their kid over and over and over. And finally, they said, okay, the spanking is needed, but you're going to spank me. And they had their child spank them. And that broke the will, not in a bad way, but it got through to the kid.
That's an
That's what
interesting
Yeshua did
approach.
for us, isn't it?
I've never tried that. I don't plan on either. Sarah would have way too much fun with that. Yep, she'd be bringing out the belt, and
Well, it
she'd be
works
using the
usually
belt
with
buckle.
Younger
and-
children, it works a little better.
So, with this understanding, how would some thoughts? One of the questions on the worksheet is, how would you define compassion? Something to think about. What are some of the thoughts that come to mind? How would you define compassion based upon the scriptural definition and description? I know Mike's got some thoughts over there. I'm putting you on the spot.
Good. Come on, Mike.
We should have the Jeopardy theme on there. Just punch the button.
That's in addition to
We have
the
pointed
worship
out
that never came to
that-
mind before.
that going into this, I would have thought that loving kindness and compassion were the same.
Interchangeable.
And compassion, I would say that the biggest thing about compassion to me is empathy and emotion. And it's in the obligation of it as far as covenant.
That is an important point, and that's something I hadn't addressed yet. That is an important point, is that compassion has to go beyond just empathy and emotion, but it has to lead to action. Because if it doesn't lead to action, that's not true compassion, right? It's not true compassion if you feel for somebody, but you're not willing to do anything, if you're not willing to act. Whether it is, punishment, or whether it is an act of, just unmeasured mercy. It still requires us to act on that. So I think that is an important distinction, is compassion. It is empathy. An empathy, an overwhelming sense of emotion that causes us to act on behalf of another. Anybody else? What are some of your thoughts, Rhoda? How would you define it?
In the action of the compassion and the rest of it, and it being part of the covenant, I would say that it becomes a mitzvah.
Yeah, it becomes a mitzvah, absolutely. Dennis. Yes, I'm putting you on the spot. How would you define compassion?
Well, definitely seeing someone and feeling what they're feeling. But at the same token, too, it can be also have, like the book says, harshness to it, depending on the situation.
Mm-hmm.
But you're right, if you don't show action through what you're feeling and seeing, then it's pretty much null.
I would say, is that Taco Bell? No, quesalupa?
You're easily distracted, aren't you?
No, I was thinking if it was Taco Bell, then what's that?
Nothing.
I was thinking Jonathan did not show compassion by not bringing in Taco Bell for him. So,
That's your opinion.
yes, that is. Mother, compassion. How would you define compassion?
I don't know, I never feel it, yeah.
believe
it's
that.
something you have to feel, I think, and I think we all do, especially for our loved ones, kids and everything, and like you say, it's just what you do about it. You can have compassion and just ignore it, but it's just how you act upon it.
Without action, it's really just a surface level compassion.
Well, as Johnny and I was out this afternoon, he seen this woman holding up a sign for her daughter wanting money, because we didn't have any money to give them, and Johnny felt so sorry for these people, but there wasn't anything we could do about it. But he wanted, he wanted to give the last dollar he had, and he would if we had it. He was asking about passion, but he couldn't do anything about it.
We talked earlier about some, rather than to try to put a definition to compassion, we found that it is difficult to put a definition to compassion and to put a definition to chesed, or loving kindness. And I used a couple of examples earlier, and I think that's a better description to understand what rachum is, compassion. Rather than put a definition to it, it's better trying to describe it through certain actions. What are other examples of compassion that you can think of? Or examples of chesed, and how they may differ from compassion, or how they may be interchangeable, because sometimes they are. What are other examples of compassion?
Let me mention one thing. One thing I feel more strong about, if somebody is hurting from the inside out, than if they're physically hurt. I feel more compassion for them. If you get somebody who's really hurting on the inside, that's harder to fix than a little cut or a broken arm or something. Yeah, what? Are you hungry?
Well, here's an example where they may cross over. We have a covenant obligation to minister to the poor, the widow, and the orphan. How we do that can vary, but we have a covenant obligation. So if we see somebody who is in need and we give to help them overcome their difficulties, we can do that out of chesed, because it's our obligation to do so in obedience, and in obedience to God and to His kingdom. And it may or may not involve compassion. It's more apt to involve compassion if we've went through that ourselves, if we have felt that ourselves, if we've went through difficult times like that. And we went through times where, I didn't know how I was going to pay the mortgage this month, or I don't know how I was going to keep the water turned on, or the utilities turned on, or how I was going to feed my family. When we have experienced that, I think it draws us to a deeper level of compassion, where we're able to feel a connection that goes beyond just a covenant obligation, but there's an intimate connection that is there.
When I was growing up, and we'd have friends or people that would pass away, and we'd attend the funeral, and of course everybody would gather at the house and all the rest of it. My mother would tell me, this is all well and good, but is anybody going to visit them? Is anybody going to see them a month from now, 2 months from now? That's when they're in the throes of missing the person. So we always did. We always took a dish or something, we went and spent the afternoon, or asked them if they needed to go to the store or do something like that.
Right.
That meant something, and knowing that they're missing their loved one. That to me is compassion.
Okay. What about in Scripture? What are some examples of compassion that we can find, besides the example I used earlier?
When Yeshua fed the 5,000.
That's true. That was compassion. I agree.
And Elijah asked the woman to make a cake from the oil in the cornmeal. And it lasted.
Very true. When Moses appealed to God on behalf of Miriam, That was compassion. He was compassionate upon his sister and appealed for her to be healed. God likewise showed compassion by healing her. Maybe not right away, but she had to experience a little bit of what she had done, a little bit of punishment. But truly that was compassionate because, as I've said before, we find it's extremely rare in Scripture to find healing from leprosy. It just doesn't happen.
He showed a lot of passion on his
On his
brothers. That was
brothers,
what they
yeah.
did to him. He showed a lot
What's
of
that?
Joseph.
Joseph. and his
Yes,
brothers.
absolutely. That is a prime example. And in fact, I think I used that example last week of Joseph as he revealed himself to his brothers. And when he asked about Benjamin and he saw Benjamin, it said he had compassion on Benjamin and he had to leave. He had to go into the other room because he started to lose it. He broke down. And it's interesting that it would use the term rahum there and compassion for what he felt for his brother. That was, that's a true definition of compassion where he just lost it. When he saw his little brother Benjamin, he lost it. And he had to go someplace private to chill out a little bit, to gather himself together so he can go finish speaking to his brothers. And it was because of that he ultimately, revealed who he was. He revealed his identity to his brothers, and he had compassion upon his brothers. And you definitely get the sense of it overwhelming, that just this overwhelming feeling of love and tenderness and closeness to his brothers that was like, I can't control it. This is just coming out of me. I can't control this.
And for him to say to them, you meant it for evil, but God turned it for good.
Mm-hmm. Certainly, although there is a connection to covenant obligation, to the Abrahamic covenant that God made with Abraham through when God told Abraham to cut the pieces. But Yeshua's sacrifice on the cross was certainly an act of compassion. Was an act of compassion that goes much, much deeper than just covenant obligation. Like I said, sometimes they cross over. That was a great act of compassion, that God had so much compassion upon us that he would send his own son to take our place. That is compassion. And that is that almost desperate feeling of, I just want my children. Like the prodigal son. In the parable of the prodigal son, and the one thing we focus on the son that returned, and we focus very little attention on the son that was faithful. But the son that was faithful didn't understand the love the father had for his son who had went away, because the father just wanted his son to come home. He wasn't concerned about punishing him. He wasn't concerned about A, B, or C. He just wanted his son to come home, to be a part of his family again. And Yeshua gave us that parable to teach us about our relationship with him, our relationship with our Father, that, he wants us to come home. That's the type of compassion that he has. And when you think about the parable of the prodigal son, can you hear the compassion in the voice of the Father upon his son who's returning? I just want my son to come home. His heart, you get that feeling in that parable that his heart has been breaking. He could excuse me. He could have been angry with his son because his son was wrong on so many levels there. Basically saying that I don't care if you're dead or alive. I'd prefer to have you dead. I want my inheritance now. I don't have to wait until you die. I want it now. But he had such compassion upon his son that he just wanted his son to come home and to reconcile with his son. You get that feeling that all the while his son was away, that the father was just like, when are you going to come home? When are you going to come home? When are you going to come home? I left the door open for you. Please come home. And that's the kind of compassion that God has for us. He cries out to us all the time. When are you going to come home? I've left the door open for you. The light is on. Come on in. Come on in.
What about the Shunammite woman, the Elisha?
Yeah.
The Shunammite woman?
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
First started out with loving kindness by telling her she's going to have a son. And then when he died, brings her back, showing compassion.
Certainly a great act of compassion. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yep, I agree. Any other thoughts? Well, please continue. If you've already went through the book, it should be pretty easy to fill out the worksheet. In fact, I see Lori's almost done already. She worked through it pretty quick. Fill out your worksheets if you'd like to. You don't have to, of course, if you don't want to. But I think it's great. It's a great benefit, even if you don't want to take the class for credit. You just want to take it for the fun of it, just to enjoy the Mussar study. It's worth it to go through the exercises, to just go through it. And next week we will look at patience.
Everyone bring a verse on patience from the scriptures. See what we do. Learn. Bring a verse from the scriptures on patience. One verse.
I'll pay you.
Yep.
Oh, okay.
Turn on that.